In today's video, we're going to be looking at a game played by Hans Niemann, how he was able to come back from a worse position and outplay his opponent. Enjoy the video. Okay, we're going to be looking at this game from Black's perspective. Hans Niemann is playing this position with the black pieces, and Tie-Dye van Nieuwen is playing this position with the white pieces. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. If I'm not, please forgive me. So the game starts out with c4. We get the English opening, e5, a very standard variation, and then knight to c3, knight to f6, knight to f3, and knight to c6. So we get 4 knights English. Now in this position, e4 is played, and then bishop to b4 chosen by Hans Niemann. There are other variations here. For example, there's bishop c5, but bishop c5 leads to this very forced line with knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and d4, this center pawn fork. Bishop to b4, d takes e5, knight takes e4, and we get into this position. There's queen f3 here. There's also queen to d4. So there are lots of options here for white. This is also somewhat okay, but bishop to b4 immediately. Let me go back here. Bishop to b4 right here is known to be one of the best lines against this setup with e4 and c4. So this is what Hans Niemann chooses. Now here, d3 was played, d6, a3, attacking the bishop. Bishop has to either take or move away, chooses to move away, and then h3 played by white, stopping bishop g4. And here bishop back to b6, bishop to e3, and castles by black. And here Hans Niemann plays knight to d4. Now, this knight to d4 move is actually a bit more sophisticated than it looks at first glance. The reason why you want to play knight d4 and the reason why you don't actually want to bring out this bishop right away is because you don't necessarily have a great square for this bishop right now. It cannot go to g4, it cannot go to f5. If it goes to e6, you're not really doing anything there. So this bishop does not really have a good square. The main thing in this position that you have to look out for with the black pieces are pawn breaks. Those are what you have to look out for. The main pawn breaks in these types of structures are f5 and d5. However, f5 is not possible right now because the knight is blocking. d5 is not possible because there are 3 pieces, 2 pawns, and a knight controlling that square. So the way you set up d5 is you need to move the knight away first. In this case, Hans Niemann chose to do it by moving it to d4, and you need to go c6 and d5 with proper setup. You can't just do it right away, but with proper setup, this is something that you can do. So this was the idea of this move, knight to d4, instead of developing this bishop, instead of developing the rook. So after knight to d4, here bishop takes d4 was played, pawn takes d4, and knight to a4. The thing is, if you jump to the center with knight to d5, this might look natural, but the problem is after knight d5, pawn d5, black will have the bishop pair. In this position, black can play moves like a5, a4, maybe even c6 in the future. So this is going to be a slightly better position for the black pieces because of the bishop pair. Once the position opens up, the bishop pair will show itself. So instead of that, here white chose to put the knight on a4, and after knight a4, this is an attack on the bishop and it has to be traded off. So c5 chosen by black, and knight takes b6, pawn takes b6, and we get this sort of a position. After castles here, bishop to d7 chosen by Hans, and with this bishop d7 idea, you're setting up b5. b5 is a very powerful move. That's why here white played a4 in order to stop it. But what happens if you go for a different plan? Let's say you try to play a move like knight to d2 in order to expand with f4. Well, in this case, what black would have done is play this move b5. Let's say you go f4, and in this position after b takes c4, d takes c4 is always going to be bad for black because this pawn will be very, very powerful, and it is just going to be an asset throughout the game, and especially in the end game. It might not be as useful right now, but this will be very useful in any end game which black goes to. So here knight takes c4 has to be played, but the problem is after d5, e takes d5, black will not take back right away. Black will start with this move b5, and after, let's say, knight to e5, here you finally take on d5, and this knight that's on d5 is coming to e3, so it is going to be on a very, very powerful square. It's attacking the queen, so the rook cannot be taken. Queen has to move away, and then here you move your own rook, and we get into this position right here, which is slightly better for the black pieces because this knight is very powerful and it is very uncomfortable for the white pieces. So going back, this b5 idea is very, very strong to actually chip away at this structure and try to get an advantageous structure. Therefore, in this position, knight to d2 wasn't played, a4 was played instead, controlling this b5 square. This is a very nice move, preventing black's counterplay. So in this position, queen to e8 chosen by Hans, b3, just simply defending the pawn, and here knight to h5 played by black. Now in this position, the idea of knight h5 is to bring this knight to f4. f4 is sort of a weak square. It's not an outpost, but it is a bit of a weak square because it's hard to play a move like g3 in order to control this square on f4. If you ever play g3, you will run into bishop takes h3. Of course, this is not what you want to do as the white pieces. So what black is trying to do here is put this knight on a very nice f4 square. So here, rook to e1 chosen by white, and then knight to f4. Queen to d2 attacking the knight here, knight back to g6, and then knight to h2 played by white. This knight h2 is also very powerful, and I will show you why this actually happened in the game. Queen back to d8 because the queen's no longer doing anything on this file or on this diagonal, so it will just simply remaneuver to d8 to then bring it to the king side, and bishop to h5 chosen by white. This is a very high level move as well because this is sort of a bad bishop on e2. If you look at white's pawn structure here, it's set up on light squares mainly. Therefore, this bishop is going to be very uncomfortable here because it does not have any good squares. So in this position, trading off this bishop either for the bishop on d7 or for the knight on g6, these are both really, really solid options. In this game, white chose to do it for this knight, and that is exactly what happened. After queen h4, bishop takes g6 was played, and f takes g6 by black, opening up the rook. So in this position, a rook to f1 was played, and then g5. So now Hans is trying to start an attack on this side of the board. Here, b4 was chosen by white. This is sort of computer calls this a mistake. The game review calls this a mistake, but it is the correct plan. It's not the correct way to do it, but the idea in this position is to start an attack on this side of the board. Actually, a slightly better move would have been this move a5. However, b4 is not that big of a mistake. The main idea here for white is to create counterplay with b4, a5. You just had to go with a5 first. This was slightly better, although now that the computer thinks about it, b4 is not so bad. So I would say this b4 being a mistake is a bit of an exaggeration. It's not nearly a mistake. I would say, if anything, it is maybe a slight tiny inaccuracy. So here, rook to f6 was played by black, and then a5 played by white. So now white's trying to create play over here, while black tries to create an attack on the king side on this white king. So here, rook to f8 chosen by black, pawn takes b6, pawn takes b4, and then f3 chosen by white, controlling this g4 square. And h5, now you're once again threatening this move g4. So queen f2 offering a queen trade. Here you don't necessarily want to trade the queens as the black pieces, because if you trade the queens, you have a worse structure here, and white is going to have a very comfortable game. You have 3 sets of doubled pawns, which is absolutely insane. Have you ever seen 3 sets of doubled pawns in a game? This is an extraordinary pawn structure. The problem is, though, it is very bad for the black pieces because all of these pawns will be targeted by the rooks and the knight, which will maneuver very, very soon. So that's why you don't necessarily want to trade the queens, at least right now. So queen to f2, queen f4, avoiding a queen trade, and then queen takes d4. So here, queen back to g3 by black, attacking this pawn on h3, trying to once again create some threats over there, and then rook to a5 chosen by white. g4, and then queen back to f2. And in this position, the problem is you can't exactly avoid a queen trade now. This queen takes f2 move is not something you necessarily want to play with the black pieces. It's more of a move that you have to play. So in this position, Hans was looking at this, and of course he saw this move queen f4, which is the only move to avoid a queen trade, and you don't lose the queen, right? If you go to h4, you're going to lose the queen. If you go to e5, you're going to lose the queen. So this is the only way to avoid a queen trade. The problem here, though, is that after h takes g4, there is this move g3, a very powerful move. This is the only move in the position. And after a move like queen to h6, there's f4. And now white gets a lot of space. Your attack on the f file and your rooks on the f file are blunted. So this structure is just very, very solid for the white pieces. Now, that's why you don't necessarily want to go for this. And that's why here queen takes f2 has to be played, and you don't really have a choice as the black pieces. So after king takes f2, here rook to g6, black trying to create some threats, g3, pawn takes h3, opening up the rook, and then rook to g1. Here rook back to f6, king to e3, rook back to g6, a bit of a shuffling here, so king back to f2. And in this position, h4 was played, and after a move like g4, here Hans Niemann realized that he might be in a bit of a trouble, so he has to do something, and he found an extraordinary move. d5, excellent move played by Hans Niemann. The idea with d5 is that after the pawn is taken, what you're going to do is you're going to put the bishop on a4, and you're going to be escorting this pawn. You want to put the bishop on c2, and then you want to push this pawn. So this is black's biggest asset right now, and this is what Hans Niemann has to use in order to create counterplay. And in this position, rook to a5 was played, which was a mistake. The correct move in this position would have been c5. However, this is hard to see because after bishop to c2, the pawn is still going to be pushed. Apparently, you have to play king to e3, but after a move like b3, you have to go king to d2. This is the only way that you're going to be able to have an advantage in this position with the white pieces. Very difficult to see. White did miss this. If white saw this, probably in this position, Hans Niemann would have won this game. However, this was missed, and instead of that, rook to a5 was played, attacking the bishop. The bishop has to move, and then king to e3 by white. At this point, though, this pawn is going to be pushed. Here, there's another opportunity to play c5, protect this pawn, and not allow the rook to get here. But once again, rook to b5 chosen, and not c5. And here, rook to a8, f4 played by black, rook to d6, attacking this pawn on d3, and then d4. Rook to a4, trying to create some threats on this king, trying to push this pawn and promote it, and d5 chosen by white, creating a square for the king and also pushing these pawns. This is an absolutely extraordinary pawn structure. You have doubled pawns on the h file. You have a passed pawn on b3 while having another pawn on b7. There's a connect 5 in the center of the board with the pawns. This is one of the weirdest games and structures that I have ever seen. However, it is actually better for the black pieces because of how powerful this pawn is, which is absolutely insane. So in this position, b2 was played by black. Once again, computer gives this a mistake. Apparently, the best move was rook to f6, but it's very difficult to understand why. It's not clear why you have to play rook f6 because this pawn's protected. Even if you win this pawn, okay, maybe you're attacking this pawn, but it's not exactly clear why you have to play rook to f6, clear to me at least. Maybe Hans Niemann saw this, but he didn't like something about it. But it's just one of those moves that's like, why are we playing rook f6? But apparently, according to the computer, rook f6 is better for the black pieces. Instead, b2 was played. This is the second computer move, and this is also not necessarily a mistake. The game review calls it a mistake, but it's a bit of an exaggeration. Once again, it is not a bad practical decision. So king to f2, and after king to f2, now finally black is better here, and Hans Niemann is in the driver's seat. Rook to a2 chosen by him. defending this pawn, and here king back to e3, and here rook back to d8, pawn to c5, and then rook to a3 check, king back to f2, and then rook to f8, now attacking this pawn, f5, defending the pawn by pushing it, and here rook back to a2, king to f3, and then queen by Hans Niemann. So here captures, and captures happen, rook takes b1, and then rook takes h2. And now, after all of those exchanges, black is up a rook. White has so many pawns and so many passed pawns that I can't even count. But this is a winning position for the black pieces, but you have to be very, very sharp with black. If you make a mistake here, you could draw the game or even lose. So you have to be very, very careful. Even though black is winning, it doesn't mean that the position is not difficult to win. So in this position, c6 was played, and after pawn takes c6, pawn takes c6, here there is a sequence of only moves here that black has to find, and Hans Niemann found it. So in this position, what you have to really watch out for are these two pawns. Even though there are pawns over here as well, they're kind of far away. They're not necessarily going to promote, and they're not dangerous right now. However, these two pawns are two connected passed pawns, and they're very, very close to promotion, and you have to be very careful. If you are able to get rid of at least one of these pawns as the black pieces, you're going to be stopping the second one. You only need to get rid of one of them. So in this position, rook to c2 only move, forcing this pawn to be pushed, and after c7, h2. And here, if a move like b7 were to be played here, rook takes c7, and after, let's say, queening here, h1 queen would have been played with the check, and then this is being attacked. There's a check on the king. If you take the queen, this queen will be taken, and in this position, even though you can take the pawn on h4, this is going to be a winning endgame because you have a rook for two pawns. It's not enough for white. So let's go back here. Instead of that, what happened was that after rook to h1 here, rook to b2 was played, and after rook takes h2, rook takes b6, now this pawn is not promoting, and it is simply going to be picked up. And now we get to a very similar situation where white has a rook for two pawns, and this is simply going to be winning because the two pawns are not enough to stop two rooks here. So a couple of moves later, what happened was that black simply brought the queen, and then here rook to a4 was played, but after a couple of moves, white resigned. After rook a1, white resigned in this position because there's nothing you can do. You cannot push the pawn because the pawn is pinned, and there's just simply nothing to be done. You can try a move like rook to b3, but there's rook to f1 check. So what do you do here? Let's say you go king to e3, there's rook e1. Now this pawn is going to be lost, and what are you going to do about it? There's absolutely nothing you can do. The king will hide out on g5, and then this pawn will be picked up, and then every other pawn will be picked up. If you go f6, check here, takes on f6, and this is simply going to be winning for the black pieces. So an absolutely amazing game and an amazing victory by Hans Niemann. He was worse throughout a decent chunk of the game. However, he fought back and he was able to equalize, and then he was able to outplay his opponent in a very sharp position. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.